We have on my right, Mykola Riabchuk, who is a writer and journalist, co-founder and member of the editorial board of the Kritika Monthly magazine in Kiev. He's the author of many books. He has translated many things into Polish, German, and French. He was prominent in the Ukrainian underground culture of the 1970s and 1980s, and he is also in my forthcoming book, The Ukrainian West, Culture and the Fate of Empire in Soviet Lviv. Immediately on my right, Eva Wójciak. She is director of the Theater of the Eighth Day. She joined the group in the 1970s, co-authoring performances such as Sail for Everyone, How We Lived in Dignity, Wormwood, and No Man's Land. Wójciak was also a keen supporter of the theater, taking to the streets, creating such successful outdoor plays as The Sabbath, The Summit, and The Ark. Further on my right is Vitaly Komar. He is a Russian painter and performance artist who was born in Moscow in 1943. He attended an art school in Moscow from 1958 to 1960, after which he studied and graduated from the Moscow High School of Industry. He began cooperating with Alexander Melamid in 1973 and collaborated with him until 2003, when the two separated to pursue individual work. Komar currently resides in New York City and has had 2 solo exhibitions at the Moscow Biennale and the Gallery Sandman in Berlin. And then last but not least, we have Volodymyr Dibrova, who is a writer, translator, and literary critic. He's preceptor at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature at Harvard University. He is editor and writer in residence at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. His most recent book, a collection of short stories, is entitled Based on a True Story, published in Kiev in 2010.
When and how you should say no, a personal story. There is a limit of despair after which you can only cry out for redress, after which you just kill. Every night I was thinking about a way of eliminating some of the guys from out there. What a shitty land it is, whose young women waste their nights on cutting people's throats. I wrote this text around 1976 for the performance How We Live in Dignity. It perfectly expressed my state of mind in those times, a culmination of defiance against the surrounding world of real socialism and against unlimited conformism. Opposition, rebellion, growing disgust, and a sense that everybody is taking part in keeping alive these lies, falsehood, ugliness, all guided me towards certain books. I read stories of rebels and revolutionaries, Decembrists, Narodna Wola, urban guerrillas from Latin America. I was also interested in the terrorists from the Western Europe, mostly Ulrike Meinhof and Gudrun Ensslin from the Baader-Meinhof group. So, on the one hand, noble terrorism of Żelabów, Perowska, Hryniewiecki, where they killed a cruel oppressor as in unarmed combat, risking their own lives, and on the other hand, terrorism that began to have random innocent victims. We were spending whole days and often also nights discussing how to fight totalitarianism and why it was accepted. Because it was actually this prevailing social acceptance that forced us to think about a tremor shock and bomb. We wanted to scream to be heard. We felt that we were drowning and that no one was paying attention to the fact that we would all soon reach the bottom together. In theater, inspired by the method of Jerzy Grotowski, we rejected his alienation, contemptuous distance towards social reality and its heroes. Practicing the acting rule of the master, we wished to ecstatically change what was within our own reach in the name of liberty, truth, and human dignity, the dignity of the ordinary plain citizens. Everyday reality quite soon made me and my friends face the necessity of defending the extent of our sacrifice to defend our beliefs and choices. We were asked to sign a letter referring to the amendments to Constitution. It was our first spectacular lesson of the police state. Followed in an obvious way, led to a trap, searched, interrogated, and in the end, intimidated. We saw what was hidden from the eyes of regular, obliging citizens. We saw the backstage of real socialism. After that moment, we would see it very often. Our life began filled with small everyday tasks relating to conscious refusal to accept the shape of the world, a lot of minor social bustling around, modest gestures such as spreading information, signing letters and petitions. There was the famous case of poet Stanisław Barańczak, who was accused of bribery and dismissed from the work at the university. We signed a letter in his defense and traveled around Poland collecting more signatures. Musicians working with us at that time refused to make this gesture of support and consequently decided to leave the theater. They formulated a statement then, which is, in my opinion, fundamental example of opportunism. This is how it sounded. One signature under a letter which will not change a thing may shatter great efforts of theater and put to the death a performance addressing significant social problems, manifesting the truth about reality. One signature under a letter which will remain a marginal event versus an artistic expression which is becoming successful. On the one hand, a letter which will probably not get a reply, and on the other, popularity and the love of crowds. We rejected this simple equation, rightly suspecting that what lies behind it is calculation, concern for one's own career, and fear of falling into disgrace. It was already at the time when the fundaments of our stance were taking form, which assumed a unity of artistic expression and of all activities of everyday life. It became our artistic credo. We believed that however dramatic and difficult the choices between values and opportunism may be, we must make these choices for the sake of the former. The consequence of forming such a stance had to be a personal decision taken in solitude, rejecting family, of not having children. In theater, we fought for freedom and truth, so we found the persecution of government an obvious consequence. Thus, in order to restrict the possibility for manipulation by those who in any case had influence of our lives, again following the example of revolutionaries from Narodna Wola, we decided to become lonely fighters for values, just that within the space of theater interpreted as a struggle. In our performances, we reached for themes relating to reality. We asked about the ethical consequences of terrorism and about state terrorism, at the same time demanding the human right to transcendence. We accompanied the democratic opposition which was developing in Poland at that time. We would sign petitions and letters, especially for the Workers' Defense Committee. We would get involved in the actions of distributing the underground publishing. The people from CORE became our mentors. They taught and supported us, and it was thanks to them that we were gaining more and more social awareness. We were conscious that an important tool in an unequal fight with totalitarianism is the truth that you prove with your own self. The ability to openly say no in public seems to be a rare quality until now, proving one's social maturity. One has to constantly cultivate it because the temptations of conformism appear in every reality, not just where citizen meets government. Conformism tends to hide also beneath the act of yielding to civil society. We realized that during the martial law, when we were deprived of the right to exist and to present our performances. It was forbidden to write about us. We were pushed to the margins, sentenced to the civil death. For almost 10 years, we couldn't leave the country, even though it was a time of particular popularity of our performances around the world. During that period, the only space of freedom for artists like us were churches. For 2 years, we performed in churches, church rooms, and churchyards. The performances we presented there did not relate to religion in any way, and still we obviously entered the world in which the borders between art, political protest, and religious manifestation would disappear. We attempted to desacralize the church by hanging a black curtain on the altar. It didn't bother anyone, and after all, the audience were often those people who used to come there before only for the mass. For us, the artists of theater, that seemed fated to have an elitist audience due to its experimental and intellectually ambitious form, the experience of performing in churches for working people was fascinating and inspiring. We had a feeling that those who were coming to see our shows, and in majority, they had not been viewers of any other theater, perfectly read the language of performances, interpreted metaphoric messages because they were free from models and cliché of interpretation and thus empathic and open. However, in the course of time, it was not the theater that would conquer the sacred, but it began to be overwhelmed by national, patriotic, and religious rituals. And it was all brought about by the elite because it was actually the artists, not the community related to the anti-communist opposition, who took up a pathetic, romantic tone. More often than not, the border between a theater performance and the performance as a part of protest would blur. On many occasions, just after the show, the song Boże, coś Polskie was chanted, and it was accompanied by raising one's fingers in a gesture of victory. We formed an exotic margin of samizdat culture, which would more and more frequently refer to simplifying black and white national and patriotic emotions. When I'm watching marches with torches in Warsaw now after the Smolensk catastrophe, protests of the defenders of the cross continuing for weeks, I think that in fact it was at that time during martial law that such attitude was developing. It was never discussed, since in the camp of conspirators they never discussed but joined forces, cherished unity and strength. Though I have a feeling that we didn't do something then, that we didn't explicitly express the autonomy of our attitude, that our no was too weak for the patriotic and Catholic elation. Moreover, we never opposed artistic kitsch, which was an inevitable part of it. Perhaps this is what I meant when I was writing a text for the magazine The Refusal in 1981. A journalist from the British Observer once asked Władimir Bukowski how he can account for the fact that he had never broke down in the hands of the torturers from the KGB. Inner strength, replied Bukowski. When a person has inner freedom, which has its source in faithfulness to oneself and friends, no one can take it away. It's easier to take away one's life. Inner freedom is individual freedom. Its space is gained by exploration. The years of work in Teatr Ósmego Dnia allowed me to understand that one can become independent from the police terror, from constraints and the terrifying interior towards it, only by creating values, expanding one's inner freedom, and exploring spirituality. Fighting against falsehood, violence, hatred, one can so easily get poisoned by them. It's so easy to get flattened, narrowed, constrained by the resistance. The fight against political authorities relying on terror becomes massive, common. The ecstasy of resistance becomes more and more frequent. Therefore, it's a more cardinal discovery that one is a combination of collective with the solitary and doubting, and that we can succumb to the collective elation with a clear conscience only when we feel that at the opposite pole we sense a hard ground of our mind able to learn and doubt. After a couple of years of my adventure with theater, which was supposed to be like dropping bombs, I was forced to leave the country. I received a passport with a stamp allowing me to cross the border only one way. I joined my friends who had left a year before, for I still had a feeling that what we were saying was significant and that the power of our message is very closely linked to this particular team of people. For 2 years we were constantly traveling through Europe. We performed being true to our beliefs and values. We shared them with the people of the West. With our somber word, we entered a satisfied and stable reality. We told them stories from the other side of the wall, presenting the essence about Osip Mandelstam. We had a sense of saving the world of Russian poetry, which was tormented in the Soviet labor camps from sinking into oblivion. Sometimes we came across voices criticizing us for imposing a sense of guilt on the audience. Perhaps that was the case. At that time, we had already believed that the Western Europe is not so much guilty as rather sharing responsibility for the Soviet totalitarianism. We also had a strong conviction of having some duties regarding people's fate. The year 1989 changed our geopolitics paradoxally. We were back in Poland. The border of civilization moved east. We suddenly found ourselves in the role of guardian, whose task was to tighten the border of the Western world. I realized that quite soon, just as a first wave of enthusiasm about regaining freedom subsided. It was also aware that a sudden promotion from a prisoner into an officer tends to be dangerous for other prisoners. This is why in the performance, The Porter's Lodge, we reckoned it was very urgent to pose questions about this change. We asked about memory, conscience, and empathy, which due to our own experience we should share with our eastern neighbors from Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. We asked if this experience of 40 years in captivity had made us sensitive to these values, or maybe had it incidentally happened the other way round. Had we become thoughtless and callous towards suffering, wars, and poverty outside our borders? I thought that getting out, freedom back, climbing up to the camp of democratic countries of the West was a gift that came with an obligation, motivating us to act for the sake of those who are still far from their goals. It was obvious to us that we had to raise these issues in our performances and get involved in the everyday activity of the real world. We created an intellectual space for pondering multiculturalism, the problems of the alienated essential mental transformations which had to be consequence of political transformation, at the same time organizing emergency aid for people from the countries at war, most of all from Chechnya, who were forced to abandon their homes. We performed in refugee camps. We invited them to our residence in Poznań so that they could share their experience and show a genuine picture of their world. We organized a seminar, The Alien, and when the second war in Chechnya began, we prepared a huge happening entitled Grozny on the Freedom Square in Poznań and later in Warsaw. After the fall of Berlin Wall and democracy had centered in Poland, we often used to be asked at home and abroad if theater committed to political and social issues still had any purpose in the new reality, since together with the fall of communism and real socialism, the enemy ceased to exist. I am not even sure if for a moment I had an illusion that I and the theater that I made have only had an eschatological perspective ahead of us to portray that everyday reality would from now on take place without the watchful eye of the artist. Yet it was so, it lasted only for a short time. Conformism, egocentrism, calculation soon defeated empathy and social sensitivity. We haven't got optimistic answer to the questions posed in Porter's Lodge. The last sentences. The wheel of history has turned. It's been 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and more than 60 since the passing of the General Declaration of Human Rights. The ruling political power has still had a tendency to be thoughtlessly possessive, to mistake its role of a civil servant and an organizer for the role of a feudal ruler. And the people still submissively allow for this. Therefore, the task of an artist is the protection of human spirituality and freedom, both in art as well as in life.
And now, Mykola Riabchuk.
Thank you very much. I feel that the entire framework of our conference requires to decide either, to answer the question either or. Either all this legacy is really alive and well, or it's kind of passing memory. I cannot answer this question in this way, either or, because it can be answered both ways. On the one hand, of course, it's passing memory, and people are dying out, and this memory evaporates because it can last only within 3 generations, basically. Children, grandchildren, and that's all. After that, this memory is passed to the books, to the encyclopedias, and so on. In this regard, of course, history of political dissent is much better recorded, and we have articles, we have paragraphs in textbooks. So far, our textbooks have not been purged completely by Mr. Tabachnik, so there are some paragraphs about a dissident movement of 1960s. But I cannot say that people of that generation play any significant role in today's Ukrainian life, maybe except for Mr. Marinovich, but Marinovich, I believe, he occupies very significant position primarily because his position was institutionalized not so much, was institutionalized by a very specific institution, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is probably one of a few, maybe the only institution from that time which was formed established as institution, and because of this it plays very important role. Nothing else actually emerged. Maybe Helsinki group still exists, but still it's very, very marginal. On the other hand, people from cultural nonconformist movement, they still are active and still are productive. They are members of ongoing of current cultural process, either in literature or art or music. They compete with the younger generation, and from my point of view, they do this rather successfully. So it's very difficult to compare these two worlds. Obviously, if we compare the moral stance of political dissidents, it's much higher. It's people who fought, who sacrificed their lives, their health, and it was really a very high standard, which is probably unachievable, inaccessible. Cultural dissent or cultural nonconformist movement was not heroic. It was rather chicken in a way, because these people avoided any political confrontation. They understood that it's a different time. So, of course, there are a lot of excuses. We can bring many explanations, but basically they were scared. They understood that huge prison terms are looming large. They entered the social scene in different period. I suggest to consider this so-called nonconformist cultural movement as a part of, on the one hand, it can be considered as a part of more general dissident movement, which was common, which was characteristic for the entire communist world. On the other hand, we can consider it also as a part of a global counterculture movement. And I'd like to emphasize this feature specifically because for that generation it was very important to catch up with the world. And they had very strong westernizing pathos in all their activities. They tried to follow the West. And in this regard, we can consider this movement as within the broader context as not only cultural movement in narrow sense, but also we can consider culture as a whole way of life. And in this regard, it was part of some other countercultural movements like Krishnaites, like hippies, like hitchhikers actually, who were also not tolerated by the Soviets. Any informal activity was not tolerated. Actually, rockers and so on. So these worlds overlapped. But what was common between political and cultural dissent, nonconformism? All these movements, of course, they were products or maybe byproducts of Khrushchev thaw. Political, but cultural movement emerged when cultural nonconformism emerged when political thaw was over. And it was clear. So it was younger generation and a generation which came in the different political milieu. There were no chances for legal activities. There were no chances for a continuation of thaw. Censorship was tighter and tighter. Soviet tanks entered Czechoslovakia, so all the hopes for socialism with human face were also disappeared. There were no temptation for compromise because compromise was fruitless. In the 1960s, poets or writers or artists, they could compromise with the regime. They could produce so-called parovoziki, which meant they could write one poem, for example, about Lenin, to glorify Lenin or Communist Party, and to publish the entire book, which was neutral or even sometimes subversive. Or the same it was in the art and so on. In 1970s, official requirements were much tighter. They required the entire books about Lenin and Communist Party. So, and they allowed one poem about some kind of lyrics, love and whatever. So it was really different environment. And obviously, this generation tried to live normal life. They they were not eager to sacrifice their life, but at the same time they had this what was called stylistic disagreement with the regime, and of course this movement was much broader because it was not endangered so much by, of course it was persecuted, people were harassed by the KGB and were expelled from the universities and fired from their jobs. It was a common thing, but basically they were not imprisoned. And because of this, they had much broader appeal because they could engage different people from different milieu. Also, they had one more advantage that they had appeal to young people of different nationalities, because in Ukraine it was very peculiar that basically the entire dissident movement was either Ukrainian or to some extent Jewish, but Russians were not involved because of many reasons, but they were, first of all, I believe that they did not felt so much oppressed as Ukrainians, but also they had some reason to mistrust this demonized Ukrainian nationalism and so on. Cultural movement, of course, was more appealing in these terms and was more internationalistic, or so to say cosmopolitan. Even the fact that people from countercultural movement referred primarily to Western models, they tried to follow Western models of art, was also important. Of course, it was much easier for this generation in one regard. They entered the scene which was politically frozen, which was much more difficult to operate. But on the other hand, it was more open in terms of cultural heritage. There was access to many more things if you compare with 1950s. Because I would remind you that until the Khrushchev thaw, until the end of 50s, virtually nothing was available of the contemporary Western art or literature or whatever. I would remind you that the first Hemingway's book, Hemingway was a progressive writer from the Soviet point of view. Nonetheless, his first book was published in Russian only in 1960, and it was very thin brochure, published in a very peculiar serialized edition, путешествия, приключения, trips, adventures, and something, and fantasy, science fiction, and it was a book about Africa, his essays and short stories. So you can imagine how difficult it was to get access to this text. Younger generation entered the scene when a lot of works were translated. Not everything, but we could read Faulkner, we could read Fitzgerald and Steinbeck and so on and so on. And the same happened also in art. Actually, we could know something about Western theater from critical books or from books critical of Western philosophy. It was a very popular book, by the way, in the Soviet Union, so-called criticism of French bourgeois contemporary French bourgeois philosophy, or criticism of American contemporary bourgeois philosophy. And the most valuable books, of course, were books with a lot of quotations. The more quotations, the better the book. So, of course, we tried to use this window of opportunity, and I would say the main strategy was to create a sort of parallel life. To live normal life, to communicate as if there is no Soviet Union, no communism outside. So we understood where the red line is. The red line was clearly contacts with the West. It was very, very heavily persecuted, and some sorts of organization, formal organization. It was also highly undesirable. We got the signals very, very early from the KGB, and we understood that this red line should not be crossed. All other activity was more or less tolerated, and because of this we could carry out informal literary readings and art exhibitions in private homes. Even jam sessions were organized, overnight jam sessions in some houses of culture, official houses of culture, but in some outskirts. So it was informal exchange of ideas, of books, of music, just of good things. And also, I feel that one more thing was very important at the time. It was, of course, looking for some alternative channels of information, because in a peculiar Ukrainian situation, we were locked in a sort of colonial situation. We had to perceive, to obtain all the information from Moscow. Moscow was the only window to the outside world. And of course, it strengthened inferiority complexes, because if you have only this window, obviously, why should you use Ukrainian language as a vehicle and so on? So for us, it was also important to find other channels via foreign languages, and of course, Polish language was the most available. It was very proximate, it was very easy to learn, and access to Polish books and films was relatively broad. We could watch Polish TV. We could. Some people could travel and to bring music and discs and so on. So Polish culture, I would say, played very important role as a mediator and as a tool of westernization, so to say. It was. I would say it was a sort of very ambiguous game with the regime. This countercultural world, of course, it interacted also with dissident world. It's very difficult to cross the line, but approaches and agendas were rather different. I remember when I was expelled twice from different universities. Once in Lviv and second time in Moscow. And in Lviv, I remember a Komsomol meeting where, because Komsomol members had to expel me from Komsomol membership and then from the institute. And I studied in Polytechnical Institute. And there was a guy who came from Institute Partcom. He brought a letter from KGB which required expulsion of Mr. Riabchuk from the institute. There were 3 points of accusation. I love these points, and I regret that I haven't picked up this document and didn't hang it on the wall within the frame. Very nice points. The first point was that Mr. Riabchuk participated in the publication of illegal journal called Skrinia, the chest. Second, he maintained relations with nationalistic elements of the city of Lviv, whatever it means. And third point was the greatest. During interrogations, he did not answer frankly. He behaved insincerely. It was excellent evaluation. The last point. I feel that today, of course, this position is such a position for society in general is more acceptable, and maybe to some extent this explains why dissidents are rather marginalized. I remember Adam Michnik, long ago, he published articles that normal people, common people, feel themselves uncomfortable with the dissidents because subconsciously they feel some sort of inferiority. We collaborated, most of people collaborated, and these people did not. So this is a sort of reminder, and it's psychologically it's very uncomfortable. From my point of view, this may explain to some extent why figures like Lena Kostenko are so popular. Of course, she's very charismatic, but also she was not imprisoned. She resisted passively. She did not collaborate with the regime, but at the same time, she did not fight openly with the regime. So maybe this figure is closer to population in general, and maybe this can explain her extreme popularity today, because such figures are more acceptable for population at large.
Thank you very much.
I really appreciate what Mykola Riabchuk said about attempt to build parallel life. It's a really interesting kind of opportunity to be in prison, as far as I understand. But for myself, from my point of view, to build parallel life, it's mean to be conformist. That's the essence of conformism, duality of the life. All my life, I feel kind of duality. You know, any kind of empire, I believe, creates such a duality, two kinds of patriotism. Universal patriotism of empire itself, like in Roman Empire or in Soviet Empire, and particularly ethnic patriotism. In case of Soviet Russia, it was Russian patriotism or Jewish patriotism or Ukrainian patriotism. And this duality, it's very typical in generally in East Europe and East European culture, I believe, because we always was between European influence and Asian influence, between East and West. And from my point of view, I couldn't build parallel life. For example, I was graduated from the Stroganov Art Institute in Moscow, the most oldest art institution in Russia. And we were taught how to make official life. I hope everybody understands my New York pronunciation, isn't it? Okay, anyway, I was taught how to make official life, official art, stylistically official, and from the content point of view, official art. But I became part of unofficial artist or underground movement or nonconformist artist, a lot of terms. During the Bulldozer show in 1974, when my work was literally destroyed by officials, I couldn't build parallel life because all galleries belong to government. All art magazines belong to government. All art sale belong to government. I don't know how some people can manage to build a parallel life, but not in my case. And that's, this duality always fascinated me because I feel this duality in myself. For example, I used to belong to a very specific segment of the unofficial art, soc art. I was one of the founders of this soc art together with Alex Melamid and another artist, our friends. And that was a very special kind of sacrification of our life. It was basically, I believe, very self-destructive instinct. You know, self-destructive instinct could be manifested in many different forms. It could be alcoholic nonconformism, you drinking to your death, or you sacrifice your life. You know, one of the Russian writer, Zahir Mazokh, was the founder of this, such a point of view of the life. And manifestation of self-destructive instinct could be from dissident to the alcoholic or to overweight person, etc. A lot of ways to destroy yourself in our life. And most of my friends, unofficial artists, it was very self-destructive people, include me, of course, include me. And what we really founded the soc art movement, analogy of conceptual art, conceptual pop art, based not on mass culture as in the United States, but based on the propaganda culture. It was also idea to unite this duality, try to establish kind of stylistic dialogue between official art and unofficial art. And now today in Soviet Union, in Russia, ex-Soviet Union, any kind of appealing to the form or subject or of official art, we can call soc art, because it was using of official art forms in context of unofficial art, in context of counterculture, as a counterculture gesture, of course. And that's why this duality always fascinated me. especially duality between, for example, in conceptual art, between text and image. Behind me, you see the kind of diptych. Actually, I feel myself as a diptych because all of us have a right and left part of our body, etc. All of us have a duality. It's a basic human duality. We are all divided between female and male. And how this kind of duality manifested in political terms is a great matter for psychoanalysis, I believe. That you see the image, and for me the most exciting thing is a line, this line between image and text. Because when I'm speaking now, for example, I am translate from Russian, because I'm thinking in Russian, I translate to English. That's another kind of invisible line between two languages. And also invisible line between image and text. Sometimes this kind of text could be between, oops. It's not working. Anyway, I'll be on the two first. It's okay. A few interesting materials, but it's changed finally. Oh, great. That's, you see the same sentence there. Clear consciousness is a result of bad memory, but between two kind of metaphorical image of the human eye. One of them erotic, another less erotic, let's say. But I tell you that actually it was two forbidden subjects in visual art. It's the eroticism and religion. That Soviet power could combine contradictive things in one. And sometimes that's back, strange, okay. Oh, sorry, forget about the images. Let's speak. I try to finish. We spoke about. Okay, you know, it's too long. I believe better just to forget about this line. I like to just speak about a lot of lines, yeah. That's, for example, sometimes you can see the line between two images. This is a diptych. You know, the disintegration of Soviet Union was chronologically part of the kind of postmodern culture. That's why I think now we try to describe the terrible tragedy of Soviet Union in postmodern culture. That's not so bad. Some people was bad, some people was good. It's a typical quotation mark of postmodern science and postmodern culture. And it's really difficult to live this past life again, to experience it twice. And nothing may be wrong with different perception of the tragedy. Sometimes we even enjoy tragedy when we see it in theater. It's many paradoxical things happen. And here you see the two paintings. One of them represents Lenin with skeleton of Karl Marx. It's a typical realistic style. And this kind of conceptual eclecticism, you see from another part, you see the combination of Russian Byzantine style icon and Russian avant-garde of beginning of revolution. And this line between these two styles, I believe it's perfect realistic reflection of not only my mind, but maybe your mind as well. Many of you believe in God and believe in Darwin at the same time. Our mind full of contradictions, especially mind of beginning of 21st century. But we don't pay attention to this contradiction. And only way to make this contradiction visible to create such a conceptual eclecticism of different styles. Because behind different style, you see the different ideas which behind this style. For example, behind icon, you can see the ideas of Christian revolution 2000 years ago in Rome, for example, in Roman Empire. And behind the realism, you can see some atheistic even ideas. The most interesting thing, the relation between collective style and individual style. That's the most fascinating thing, actually. Because in frame of historical style, we can see a few individualities. For example, take a few impressionists. For example, Sisley and Monet, Claude Monet. You see, if you compare them with Renaissance, they're almost same. But if you see them together, you see that each of them express highly individual style of self-expression in frame of collective style. That's why it's not so simple to say that socialist realism was the same. Actually, I can see a lot of difference between individual artists which was framed in socialist realism collective style. The same thing we can see among the abstract expressionism in the United States. It's not just abstract expressionism as a collective historical style. It's a lot of individuality express themselves in frame of this collective historical style. That's basically, I believe, all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we will have Volodymyr Dibrova. And I should add, he's also in my book in the conclusion. So he is there.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's not... Thank you for inviting me. It's not only a great honor to be able to speak here, but just to be in the company of people whose courage and integrity I've always admired. William Risch, the moderator of our panel, gave us guidelines, 3 questions that he would like us to keep in mind while we are talking. So as an obedient panelist, I'll try not to deviate from the general line. So the first question was, what was the extent of your conflict with the regime? Well, my only claim to nonconformism is based on the fact that I never ever wanted to belong to a dominant crowd. I never craved for security that such sense of belonging allegedly guaranteed. Come to think of it, I didn't even want it and don't even want to be on the side that's winning. As soon as I realized who I am, I mean, politically, ethnically, and artistically, it became obvious to me that I have to part ways with the omnipotent ideology and its pillar institutions. I also figured out that I was not cut out to be a political fighter or even a no-hold-barred dissident. So I had to develop some sort of defensive mechanism. Luckily for me, my formative years, which stretched from late 60s to basically mid-80s, were a relatively benign period in the Soviet history. There were no large-scale repressions or witch hunts, only from time to time some surgical purges. After the waning of the Khrushchev's thaw, it became clear that Marxism-Leninism was bankrupt, and the authorities had to tolerate those who made no secret of their skepticism of or even disdain for the official ideology, provided they kept their views to themselves. Another factor that made dissent possible was the ethos of intelligentsia that not only survived the upheavals and revolutions of the 20th century and wars, but paradoxically flourished under communism. The reason, perhaps, was that in the absence of a civil society or religious education, the humanistic moral values of the 19th century Russian literature served as a compass of decency in this topsy-turvy world of ever-changing expedient dogmas and slogans. In practice, it meant that you could be a nobody socially, but still had a intellectually fulfilling life and enjoy the respect of your like-minded peers. You could live on a pittance, but you would not starve or have to worry about being evicted from your apartment. And if you lived in a big city like Kiev, you could become a part of a vibrant cultural counterculture. or underground. I was not exactly an underground character. I went to university. I always had and kept a job, first as a technical translator, and then as a, I went on to teach in what now is Kiev Linguistic University. As a teacher, I was expected to look after the ideological upbringing or education of my students, and so to be a sort of a commissar figure. Yet, the miraculous thing was that once, following Solzhenitsyn's advice, I decided not to be the instrument of lies, not to utter words that I considered false or wrong, morally or politically unacceptable. It didn't really take much courage to follow that principle. I guess I had it so easy because I was not properly tempted or tested or extremely lucky or all of the above, but in my case, that's how it was. Basically, what I needed was a breathing space for my hobby, which was literature. Also, from time to time, I staged plays for the student theater. Some of them had no chance of being seen on a professional stage for political reasons, like UNESCO, or simply because they were unknown, like Woodhouse or Ellen Ayckbourn. Yet, since these productions were made in English, nobody bothered to censor them, and I never really had to ask for any permission. I guess it was a mild violation of copyright, of course, but all I can say to my defense is that it was a totally non-profit, once-in-a-lifetime event. So to answer the first question, I'd say there was no conflict between the regime and myself, only creative, non-violent, non-cooperation. Of course, publishing my own works was out of the question, but at hindsight, I can see that probably for me, these 20 years was a necessary gestation period. After all, I'm a late bloomer. The second question, how have the views you had back then changed today? Well, for one thing, they're getting less complicated and more straightforward with every passing year. I used to be a political junkie, an avid listener of Western broadcasts, not anymore. And of course, almost 20 years that I spent in the USA inevitably changed my perspective on the world, on Ukraine, and on myself. I no longer perceive the world in political or even moral terms. I found out that for many people, ideologies, party, or religious affiliations are like clothes. So how can you judge people or their actions on the basis of what they wear? There is a danger that soon I may end up with no political views at all, if only because many of my assumptions and predictions turned out to be totally off the mark. I'll skip some part. On the other hand, the foundations that were laid back then are pretty much the same. And the guiding principle, if there is one, still calls for opening up of one's mind rather than preserving or cherishing some sacred values. If I have to sum up my so-called convictions, I would use two quotes. One from Mahatma Gandhi, "Be the change you want to see in the world," and another from American writer Flannery O'Connor, who said that, "Be properly scared and go on doing what you have to do." The third question, what lessons learned then can be applied to Ukraine, Russia, Poland today? I really don't know the answer to this one. There are at least two reasons for that that make any sweeping generalization so difficult and dangerous. First, we're dealing with three markedly different countries here, and each of them has a very distinct story to tell. And second, I haven't lived in Ukraine since '93. So my angle is that of a well-meaning fan, not a player. But I suppose this perspective could also come in handy once in a while, especially now, given the disaster that Ukraine has become, the madness of self-destruction that the country plunged itself into, the universal corruption, the rolling back of all the achievements of the first 20 years of independence, the criminalization of power, the apathy and cynicism of people, and so on and so forth. I used to blame all of it on the 20th century disasters, like the decapitation of the nation, the trauma of relentless terror, and above all on the famine. How else can one explain the irrational behavior of the thieves who are now masquerading as national elites? Or the fact that most of them were freely elected by their victims? But I'm not so sure that this is the only plausible explanation. Yet blaming communism for all our troubles would be, in my opinion, wishful thinking and a form of blindness. Some experts on Ukrainian character, like Gogol or Kvitka or Ivan Franko or Dovzhenko or Ostap Vyshnya, very perceptively diagnosed our national malaise long before the tragedies of the 20th century struck hard. One of the most uncomfortable questions that they posed is this: do we really want to have a separate national identity? Apparently the jury is still out on that one. In the meantime, sitting on the fence proves to be an integral part of our DNA, and what a perfect recipe for disaster that is. If there is such a thing as Volksgeist, as Johannes Herder once suggested, then we Ukrainians could be characterized as solitary creatures. We don't hunt in packs. We are more like raccoons, or antisocial, quarrelsome, nocturnal scavengers, or very down-to-earth, pig-headed peasants. It was okay for Czeslaw Miłosz to call himself an obstinate Lithuanian peasant, so I hope I'll get away with this self-definition as well. Our intelligentsia, the part of the national body that is supposed to think things through, to articulate ideas, to lead, for the past 200 years had been mostly preoccupied with the unresolved issue of national survival. Perhaps it could be helped because it is a legitimate manifestation of all the anxieties and insecurities of a perpetually threatened minor nation. Unfortunately, it comes coupled with a feeling of self-pity and self-victimization. And I suspect that it is these two components that prevented Ukrainian intelligentsia from building a functioning post-totalitarian modern state. They had the power, and they had all the time, almost 20 years, to work towards the goal, but they spectacularly blew it. Some people claim that Ukrainian intelligentsia, the dissidents of the 60s included, were not up for this job in the first place, that for decades their whole existence depended on the wishes of the authorities, that they were brought up not to exercise their free thinking, but to carry favors, to translate into artistic images that ever-changing general line, or that these writers turned politicians are hardly idealists, but more likely a bunch of hardcore opportunists. Others say that beneath this "let's join Europe" sloganeering, or the most hysterical claim of our uniqueness, of samobutность, lies a profound and pervasive fear of the mainstream and ultimately of freedom. And that despite this craving for the recognition, these people are happy in their shallow, cozy swamp and have no real desire to swim in the deep waters of the wide-open, shark-infested ocean. Apparently, that is what paternalism and isolation do to you. One can also find a workable explanation of such behavior in the so-called Stockholm syndrome, the dependency on and the affinity with your captors, no matter how cruel or irrational they are. Which brings me back to the topic of this conference, this whole issue of nonconformism and dissent. The idea being that dissent is a form of moral resistance to the oppressive political system, an integral part of individual rights and freedoms, which are universal in nature, and in this day and age have no borders. And this is absolutely true. One could trace the origins of this concept back to the Age of Enlightenment or to Renaissance. One can also say that this is the cornerstone of the mindset of the Eastern European intelligentsia. And nobody can doubt the positive and healthy value of dissent for the functioning of any society. Even here in the United States, which were founded by the dissenters, the urge to conformity and thus to stifling the dissent is very strong indeed. I have a long quote from the late Tony Judd here, but you would believe me. And so it's also universal. Now let's switch back to Ukraine because we are running out of time. The paradox of our Volksgeist, the way I see it, is this. Being originally people of the steppe, we are by definition unruly individuals, anarchists and contrarians. A long time ago, a mother of a friend of mine, a veteran of the Gulag, told me that it was the spirit of rebellious contradiction that distinguished most Ukrainians from other inhabitants of the Soviet prison and prisons and labor camps. And it was perhaps a quality that helped us survive decades, even centuries of oppression and subjugation. This and the survival trick of rolling over and playing dead. But as the recent history shows, this could also be a case of blessing turned into a curse. With this kind of disposition, you have your eyes always fixed on the negative. You get obsessed with the doom and gloom. While the minimum requirement for a successful nation building is positive attitude. And apparently, this is what the contrarians lack. And that's why we could be successful as individuals, but not as a nation. And the rule of thumb is that no matter how clever or gifted such individuals are, at least they would wind up as a much-needed building material for other nations, or at worst, as a black hole. Since it's a kind of a standard, I'm finishing, it's a kind of a standard requirement here to end up on a positive note, I'll try to follow the rule. Italian philosopher Gian Battista Vico once famously remarked, sembrano travestie sono opportunità, meaning in the middle of turmoil there is always an opportunity. I believe that the recipe for overcoming this current crisis is really very simple. All you have to do is to turn the curse back into a blessing. And how do we do that? By relying on our individualistic instincts. They attack your language, start speaking Ukrainian. They try to dismantle your national institutions, be that institution. As Taras Shevchenko, a Ukrainian poet, once said, "A na hromadu hoch naplюй," and don't give a damn about the community. Believe me, they won't be able to do anything with you. After all, there were only 1 million plus Estonians in the Soviet Union, and now Estonia introduced euro as its currency. In other words, be Ukrainian, whatever it means to you. The beauty of this whole Ukrainian project is that it's an open, all-accepting, and all-embracing club. As somebody once said, it's easy, all you need is love. Thank you.
I'm thinking of Sotsart in 1973, or correct me if there's another date there. But when you began, what were your influences? Were they Western? Looking back, what was most major? And what is the collective entity against which you understand your individuality now? Because, of course, that will be different.
It's a question to me, right?
It is, to you in the first instance. Thanks.
Okay. I'm already said that Sots art, which actually word which was invented by Alex, by me, by both of us, such a term not exist. And if you look at this term, you see the answer. Sots is a short for socialism. Socialist, realist. Socialism, realist. Социалистический реализм. And art we took from pop art, which was quite popular in the 60s. Because Soviet art and Russian art, or Moscow art, Moscowite art, face very interesting problem, similar to problem which was faced in the United States a little bit early in the late 50s. It was a division between two kinds of art. One art in museums and another on the street. Two different kinds of art. In museums, in United States museums, was a mostly abstract expressionism, because variety of realism and abstract art was mostly before the end of 40s. After 40s, abstract expressionism became only way to become successful artists in American art, and surrealism, of course. But if you look in the street, from the window of museum, you see the advertisement of Coca-Cola and Campbell soup, etc. It was two different cultures. And so-called mass culture and so-called culture of elite, museum culture and culture of the street. And the same, very similar problem was in Soviet Union at this time. At museum, during the Stalin time, you can see just only socialist realism, executed in realistic style. And if you look in the window, you see the last remains of Russian avant-garde, so calling the propaganda art, or art of visual agitation, or art of visual propaganda, better to say. Наглядная агитация. It was a kind of conceptual official art which survived Stalin time, and was a kind of branch, only one branch which survived from the first Russian revolutionary years. All these white letters with exclamation marks, kind of red installation, construction, etc. And it was a kind of contradiction, of course. And pop art established a dialogue between elite art of elite, museum art, and art of the street. They brought, simply, literally brought the street images to the museum environment. The same thing happened now with soc art. Only art of visual propaganda exists, survived, it was soc art, because all other was just vanished by winter time, by rain, by change of the leadership, etc. No one original piece of street art, propaganda art on street didn't survive. All of them was vanished. Nobody collect them, actually. And a very similar fortune with advertising of Coca-Cola. Basically, it's an interesting conceptual similarity between art of advertising or commercials and propaganda, because I can see propaganda of Coca-Cola mean commercials of Coca-Cola, or I can say commercial of Communist Party, I mean propaganda of Communist Party. That's actually very close ideas. And of course, it was influence of the early avant-garde art first, which we share with United States, because as I said, the modernism and avant-garde was born with socialist ideas, and they died with postmodernism. It's chronologically the same story. They started together and dying together. And of course, it was a lot of influences, definitely. And I hope we influenced pop art as well. When I met together with Andy Warhol, I worked not only with Alex Melamed, I made one work together with Andy Warhol, for example, and with Fluxus member, Fluxus group, American Dadaist artist. And I believe we also influenced some of American artists. For example, this famous Hammer and Sickle series by Andy Warhol, etc. I believe the elements of soc art also was adopted by American art as well. And in case of conceptual eclecticism, I can say that we were really pioneers. Because David Sully and another postmodern artists, they start to combine different styles only in the beginning of 80s. We started to make it at 70s, beginning of 70s, but nobody really pay attention. That's a matter for future art historians. Thank you.
Anna Procek. My question refers to, and comments refer to, Mr. Komar as well. In your presentation, you seem to place destruction as a result of alcoholism and destruction as a result...
No, it's not true. I said alcoholism, one of the ways to destroy yourself. Okay. I didn't put it in as a result and reason. No.
Not as a result. No. Yeah. Definitely not as a result, and this is not how I understood it. My question, my comment refers to the fact that you seem to view them on more or less the same level. It reminds me of our talks when we were active in Amnesty International and other human rights organizations, when we approached Soviet diplomats. Their response was, these people are mentally unbalanced. They are self-destructive. They know they will be sent to Siberia. They have been already there. They know they will not return. And my impression is that that would have been also the attitude of these Soviet diplomats with respect to the artists in Poland, whose position was so beautifully presented by the first speaker ever, Wójciak, when it was possible for these artists to return back to Poland and perform in Poland, it was not sufficient to them. They had a higher idea, and they went to Chechnya because they felt a duty. And I simply wanted to point out that there is a difference, and very strong difference.
That's exactly what I said.
Okay.
I said the self-destructive instinct has so many faces.
What I want to say...
let me finish.
Okay, it's not a self-destructive instinct, okay? It's not a self-destructive instinct, and that's my point.
We are not semantical discussion.
Could I complete, because you will have a chance to respond. And my second question, second point, refers to the presentation by Mr. Riabchuk. You mentioned that Nina Kostenko is very popular, and it's partly because she, even though she was partly part of the dissent in the 1960s, she did not go against the government to the end. My impression is that if individuals like Ivan Svitlichny and Vasily Stuss would be still alive today, and those were the really great artists, then they would be popular too. Would you agree with that or not? And with respect to Mr. Dibrova, I think it was a beautiful attempt from the literary and also psychological point of view to analyze Ukrainian society, and I suppose you had in mind also the dissenters, right? Or the nonconformists. What I would suggest, since this is the end of the conference, and this is at least the fourth conference on dissent that I'm attending here at Columbia, at least at 3 conferences, the question of the marginalization of the dissenters, Russian, Ukrainian, and others, ought to be addressed. And not just, I think, this or that, but really approaching it, a thorough study from the political point of view, what you have done from the literary point of view. And here, what needs to be consideration are not only the conditions in Eastern Europe, but in particular, also the pressures from the West. What role did Americans play? And this is not to you. This is to the organizers of the conference, that I trust that next time when such a conference will convene, that this question will be taken seriously. Thank you.
My language is visual language, but I'll try to resolve your semantical problem. I believe when I speak about instinct, I doesn't mean that it's no rationality or no emotions behind that. For example, sublimation of the self-destructive instinct has a many different way. It could be altruism. I can say the altruism is also kind of sublimation of masochism. But the problem of individual way in life, everybody found her or his own way of life. How we sublime our instinct, it's our personal way. And I know my friends, many of them died very early by many reasons. And I tell you that self-destructive instinct really was very, very visible in this way of life. Some of them, that if I sacrifice my life in the name of future generations, I can tell that all, even early communists during capitalistic society, which sacrifice their life and fight for the utopian vision of the future, they also was self-destructive. And if some Russian officials say self-destructive, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that I don't have to use the same dictionary with them. All of us share dictionary of Russian language. In this case, we speak English. But I think nothing wrong. You took term self-destructive very tragically, very personal maybe. It's just my suggestion. Yes.
Now, I should address the second question, probably. Yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to make clear that generation of 60ers, so to say, шестидесятники, consisted of very different people. All of them benefited initially from the Khrushchev thaw. They were born by this Khrushchev thaw. Then, when it was frozen, a majority began to collaborate with the regime. Only minority fought, and most of them were imprisoned. Today, I believe, well, since Ukraine's independence, of course, none of those people could be good politicians. Somebody mentioned today that, well, dissidents typically are bad politicians, but in Central East European countries, they played very important role to change the regime and to establish some new rules of game. They played this role of, so to say, third-party enforcement. Yeah? Due to them, absolutely new game began in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Lithuania, and so on. In Ukraine, they were in minorities. Civil society was underdeveloped. Civil society was not able to bring these people to power. You know how many voters supported Vyacheslav Chernovil. It was exactly the same number which supported Ukrainian independence in March 1991. If you remember Gorbachev's referendum, when he offered preservation of the renewed federation, it was the same, absolutely. 20-something% voted against Gorbachev's federation in March. In December, 20-something% voted for Chernobyl. This is more or less the size of Ukrainian civil society, of Ukrainian citizens who are conscious citizens. The rest are the population, just the population, populace. And of course, in such an environment, these people could not play a political role. Some of them were engaged into the new government. Communist nomenclatura embraced them and suffocated some of them, compromised, like people like Lukyanenko. Otherwise, others were marginalized. Stus, of course, is exceptional. Stus is a great poet, and probably he would remain great poet. He would be today one of the greatest poets in Ukraine, much greater, to say frankly, greater than Lina Kostenko. Svetlichny probably also would have been very good literary critic and culture figure. I don't think he was a great poet. He was a good poet, but primarily he was a good literary critic and cultural figure, yeah. But still, you know, we have underdeveloped institution of public intellectuals, and this problem plagues the entire Ukrainian culture. This stems from the fact that civil society is underdeveloped, Ukrainian identity is underdeveloped, and so on, so on. So these people cannot play as important role, as prominent role as they played in Poland or Czech Republic. Unfortunately, we have structural constraint.
There was well, thank you all. This was very wonderful and enlightening. There was a strong kind of dichotomy in this in terms of the relationship between art and politics, which I found interesting, and I wonder if you would all think about it and reflect on it more. Eva Wójciak talked about how they crossed over into politics, how they signed the petitions in '75 against the constitutional amendments, how they defended Baranchak, how they got involved in the colportage of Bibuwa, and how that theater became politically committed. From the other three figures, I heard that nonconformism was an attempt to create space, kind of to separate from the state and create a personal space in which one could be creative. And I'm wondering if you could all talk a little bit about what was involved in your calculations, either to cross over the line from art and the separation of art from politics, or to try and maintain that. I think if we could contrast those a little bit, we might learn a little bit more about differences between different forms of nonconformism and resistance activity.
This is a very old question about the politics and the art. Very old, in the 70s also, very often used by the power also, that the art is something, I mean the politically engaged art, sorry for my English, but I'm not...
You're fine.
that politically engaged art is something worse than art, that real art is something which is distant to reality, to political activity. It's a very old problem until now. I mean, to make political art, it means to do something not real art. I mean, it's kind of a stereotype. I don't agree with it. I think that there is no distance between being engaged in reality and do in the same time eschatological, or how to say it in English, transcendental, put the transcendental question in the same performance, the same art. So it's funny because it's 40 years I'm making theater, and still I answer this question. Of course, thank you for this question because it's very important, but it's still function, the stereotype, that to engage in politics is something worse, lower. And I believe very much that it's this, I come from this kind of artist. I know that it's not, it's very particular, but I believe in kind of duty. I mean that I have to do something, and I never close my door to reality and to ordinary people. I usually look for connection between facts and the universal meaning of them. But for me, inspiration is coming always from reality. I can't leave it. I mean, I can't leave.
I have little to add. I believe that the main legacy of political dissidents is moral legacy, high moral standards. If we speak about cultural figures, the cultural movement, basically nobody cares much about their moral stance. We care about the quality of their art. And these are very different things, different criteria are applied.
I really can't see the difference between art, what we call just art, and we call political art. I don't know really what we're talking about in this case. For example, 1,000 years artists made illustration to the Bible, and subject everybody knew, of course. And it was a literal illustration to the kind of literature, to history, because Bible was considered as a history. And relation between historical subject now and historical subject in the past, for me, not really very important. For me, politics is a history now. For example, exodus of the Jews from the Egypt. It's also politics. It's description of politics and depiction of the politics. But it's old. It's a history. What we will call history tomorrow, now we call politics sometimes. But I'm always work with history. History is my obsession. And I try to see history in now. I always try to find historical moment in this life. Mostly it's related to the war and peace, of course, as Leo Tolstoy said. It's also related to the prison and not prison, crime and punishment of Dostoevsky. As you know, Socrates say that if government kills somebody, we call it justice. If somebody calls somebody, we call it crime. And maybe we can call politics something which focusing on these problems. What is the invisible line between what's state allowed to do and what individuality not allowed to do. Protest against war or manifestation for peace on the street, etc., manifestations. Maybe that's political performances. But for me, it's always history. It's a part of history. And everything for me is a history in some way. Not history as a past, but history what excited me. because the time and movement of the time is the most mysterious thing in this life for me. And I feel movement of the time. I'm hearing the sounds of the sounds in hourglass in this case. It's really very mysterious feeling, and it has nothing to do with political cartoon, but political cartoon metaphorically sometimes really brilliant art. Some, for example, Polish posters, political posters, was really on the level of Magritte surrealistic paintings. And we can find even Magritte influence of political Polish posters, a lot of influence of Magritte. And we know that surrealists signed manifestos together with Trotsky. It couldn't be such a strong division between history now and history in general.
Let me be blunt. Politics and arts, those are totally different realms. And and we can find it in every great artist. He or she or they come up to their work with some political ideas, political agendas. But once they're in it, they have to drop all this nonsense because it's a totally different game. An artist is a creator. Can you imagine the creator, the maker of heaven and earth and all things visible and invisible, that would create something, and with the fingerprints of his fingers all around the place, he should remove himself from this picture. And you may call it politics. There should be no politics. He should create an ideal universe, which is a piece of art.
Viktor Balashov. I would follow up maybe with a question in different way. Yesterday, a different panel and Katya Nepomniachtchi addressed about the role of religion or church and the dissident or nonconformist movement. I'm familiar with the art of Komar and Melamed and translated their texts and definitely not images in the 75 when there was first exhibition here in New York. And I was sort of puzzled with a lot of things, but what epitomizes to me, and you mentioned the subject of Catholic Church in Ukraine, and Yeva mentioned the role of theater in the church, and what epitomizes to me is the role, and I'm Russian, that what's happening in Russia and the theme, Nonconformism and Dissent, and so guiding legacy and memory. And what's happening now over there, like the two exhibitions in Moscow in Sakharov Museum, which sort of, I would say, imitate your art, so it's art. And most artists were past artists. And they were vandalized by a religious crowd who was inspired by the church. And the second one, there was pseudo art, the same like yours, here, you know, we will see. And the same religious, you know, iconic images. And the other exhibition was called sort of a peep show, pseudo-erotic, to attract attention. This one wasn't vandalized. They closed, Sakharov Museum closed itself for the reason, and they are really the only institution besides Memorial that was mentioned by Peter Radaway, that a legacy of dissenters, you know, in Moscow and in Russia. So they risk to close the whole institution. What I mean, the Sakharov Museum and the Center. So they just closed the exhibition. And two guys who were not artists, they're curators and the organizers, like these ones, you know, they were losing their jobs for exhibition of it. You know, artists didn't suffer. Also, one lady committed suicide when she immigrated, feeling persecuted. So it's deja vu to me. You know, as I address the issue of KGB, now I'm addressing the issue of another powerful ideological force, Orthodox Church. It could be not only Orthodox Church, it could be the other church, you know, more balanced in their approaches. But Komar may be more you know, acute to this thing, but I can envision what kind of answer I could get from him. But from your perspective, what role, you know, or what the legacy, as I mentioned, this example that the persecution continues, it's there. Nothing changed. Only the institution of KGB now become, dressed up in the Orthodox Church and its, legitimacy in the minds of the people. When they mocked the religious symbols, Komar and Melamed, in their conceptual art, and it was appealing, but it didn't affect, and they couldn't be persecuted for religious blasphemy. When the artists who are of his generation are definitely under the, on the risk of losing their, not freedom, but, definitely their artistic positions. So it's up to you today, Vitaly may answer me.
What's the question about? I didn't get it.
Well, the question, the legacy, what do you say, your art and this imitation of the exhibitions of more or less the same.
The question.
The question, what are you thinking about it? What's the story? What's the art?
I didn't participate in this show, and this show had no soc art, because as I said, definition of soc art, it's
I'm not asking you.
Of official.
I'm asking you as an artist, not as a soc artist. I'm asking you because you represent
I'm against
all the artists.
Okay, I'm against any. Right.
And non-conformist.
Okay. I'm answering. I am against any kind of censorship. That's all.
We're all against it. I think we should.
But you asked me how I related, how I reacted. I'm against this terrible gesture of the, but it was not gesture of religion. It was a gesture of some of the priests. Don't mix religion and clericals. It's a different thing.
Frank Sisson, maybe I'll continue on religion, but religion is civilizational divide, East and West. This long-term thing, it's one of the problems we face when we deal with Poland as opposed to Ukraine to a degree, and even more so to Russia, is this old issue of East-West and civilizational. I must say, when Eva Wójciak talked about the churches where they put the cloth up and then did the play, one could not conceive of an Orthodox community accepting that. This would have been a desecration of the church equal to that the communist regime had done and the Bolsheviks had done. That is, there would be an instinctive almost reaction in an Orthodox society against it. So it couldn't happen, which I think is interesting when you think of the time that has gone on with it. I was struck as we talk about, there were a few things on intellectual things in some of our earlier conversations. I thought of Danilo Shemuk, who we talked about today, I guess was the longest-term Ukrainian political prisoner, starting from the Polish period, going through the German, into the Soviet. For 42 years, I think he was in prison. And when he was asked, why didn't you break, he said, I had the advantage of not being an intellectual. And I thought of that frequently in our discussions as we talk about how people react. That is, the same issue is when our musicians came up. I thought the musicians, unlike the simple man, unlike the man without talent in his own mind, unlike the one who could not think of why I should then break, of course could give quite an interesting argument as to why we should do this. The music's important, the things we do are important, we should make a compromise. I think dismissing that idea of what they've done is also a bit dangerous, and that reminded me of Lena Kostenko. And I remember in, I think, 1978, I was in Lviv. I had met a Russian woman who taught at the conservatory. And in thanks for her doing some nice things for me, I gave her a volume of Lena Kostenko. She had lived for 25 years in the city, but had never heard of Lena Kostenko. She went into work and discussed with her Western Ukrainian colleague, said there is this unknown poetess in Ukraine named Lena Kostenko. Of course, Bogdana Ivanovna, or whatever she has, said, well, who hasn't heard of Lena Kostenko? But two people in Lviv in that atomized society hadn't. So when we think of Lena Kostenko and why she, what the decisions people make and why she carries such weight and importance today, well, one of the reasons were that she was, at least to a degree, things she wrote were being distributed into society, were acceptable to the people who were not going to go that step or were not predisposed. This was a daughter of a Russian military man from Sevastopol, was not going to touch any book of the dissident Samizdat and Samvidal that we talked about earlier. And so I think that whole gray zone, in a way, where the lines are drawn when we're doing it, is something that we have to return back to in this nonconformity dissent. Of course, some of the people wound up being punished who never thought they would dissent, and some of the people who dissented in a certain way wound up not being punished, as we've heard. And I think in many ways, as we worked with this conference, and we're coming closer to our ending of it, we have to think about these more general categories of where these spectrum are and what significance they had. And of course, we have the advantage of people who lived through this and had to deal with it.
Hi, I'm a playwright, and I have seen the work of the Theater of the Eighth Day and have talked with Eva. And I'd like to ask a question of both her and Vitaly about politics, religion, and art together. I see certain people on the file say there's a great dichotomy between them. They're separate things. But if you look at artists in history, they can be great artists and deal with political ideas, like Goya, the disasters of war. Great art, but also intense political and social criticism. I think the dichotomy is art that is effective in expressing something and art that is not effective for various reasons, either through lack of skill or courage or anything else. I'd like to ask a question about audiences as a playwright. I look at the theater here in New York, and it is circumscribed. Most of the theater is circumscribed. It's a certain kind of personal theater. It is not political for the most part in any sense, or not religious either. It is, should we say, mainline theater, bourgeois theater, whatever you want to call it. Then you have experimental groups that deal with surreal things and such like that. How do you see your audience? I remember the performance in Rosen of Time of the Mothers in a town marketplace where ordinary people came to see this performance and they were moved, which was eye-opening to me. How do you see your audiences, even historically and now, Eva, and how do you see your audiences for your art? You do show in museums and galleries, but is there another aspect to it? Thank you.
How to say it? The audience, I never do performances for particular audience. I mean, when I do something, I want to say something, believing that I have a chance to get a contact with average people. I never do performances to do theater for elites with this kind of intention. That's why we are doing now a lot of outdoor theater, because it's very attractive way of trying to do in the same time the high art without any compromises, and try to touch just ordinary people, because sometimes they are just crossing the way. They are not spectators. And after this experiences in churches in the 80s, I think I'm to the end attracted by this kind of looking for the audience, which is not typical theatrical spectators, viewers. And this is the big attraction of making a theater, especially outdoor theater, that you have a chance to be among ordinary people, that art can have a sense for these people also. That's why I believe also in this, that the art can change something. I mean, that it makes a sense to do the art which is politically inspired. What doesn't mean that it's political in the sense like newspaper, is what I don't mean, but politically inspired, that it can change the world. I am the witness that it happened.
Thank you. Miroslav Maranovic, who began this conference, will now end it with the final question.
It's almost, I started the conference and now I finished. Thank you. I would like to make one comment about this discussion about self-destruction. I honestly tried to check myself about that, and I have to acknowledge that there was only one moment which has some similarity. I mean, when you, for example, enter into a hunger strike, it's very difficult to get out of it. Psychologically, very difficult. It may be read by some others as desire for self-destruction, but it is not. It is some psychological inertia, which is very common for all people. I know that such the different perspective was used by Soviet psychiatrists to explain the behavior of dissidents as a psychiatrist deviation, as a psychological deviation from the norm. It was very logic as well. But I would say that the very approach to the problem is unacceptable for me because it is a typical secular perspective which presupposes non-existence of a moral approach. And what I mean is sacrifice. The word sacrifice, we cannot equate it with self-destruction. Otherwise, we will have quite a lot of human history self-destructive. For Christian nations, then they are people who lead themselves to self-destruction. And I know at least one Jewish person who led himself 2,000 years ago to self-destruction and led the whole humanity to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and it was a great honor, a great pleasure that Mark invited me to this conference to head the last and hopefully one of the best panels that we've tried to do here.
All the